exploration of molt in woodpeckers. And so I put this talk together based on the information in the new edition of the Pile Guide. But Peter also jumped in and added a little bit more information. So we're gonna step in from there. So I think most of you folks, I recognize a lot of names in the list, but in terms of just the language that we're going to use, I wanted to go over some of that so that everybody's on the same page. So we're going to use the modified Humphrey-Parks terminology. And what that means is that, anyways, we're going to use the modified Humphrey-Parks. So birds are going to have basic plumages, alternate plumages, and formative plumages as we move through. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology, Humphrey and Parks state that all species have a basic plumage. All species of birds have at least a basic plumage. And how the birds get into that plumage is through the pre-basic molt. Okay, and in this pre-basic molts, part of the assumption of that is that most or all feathers are molted during this pre-basic molt. Some other important terms is that the pre-juvenile molt, which is technically the first pre-basic molt, is the molt that occurs in the nest. And it's when the first real set of feathers are put in. So they're not the fluffy natal down, but the actual first structured feathers. And these juvenile feathers are important because they are poor quality, and that's due to the lower barb densities. So they just don't have many barbs, and so they're different than any subsequently replaced feathers. Okay, and then the first fall, late summer molt is the pre-formative molt, and that's when we get juvenile feathers replaced for the first time. And usually not all feathers are molted during that, in that pre-formative molt, just because the birds don't have the resources to replace all of the feathers that they would as they can in later in life. Okay. The second fall molt, which happens at about a year of age, is the second pre-basic molt. So unlike passerines, this molt is not complete. Okay, and some juvenile feathers are retained, and because they have retained juvenile feathers in woodpeckers longer, it's the key to aging woodpeckers within the first 3 to 4 years of life. So we can be more specific and age them for longer because that second pre-basic molt is not complete. So woodpeckers don't have a pre-alternate molt, so we're not going to be covering anything about pre-alternate molts tonight, but we're going to go from there. So we're going to jump into the downy woodpecker. And if you have your second edition of the Pile Guide part 1, you can follow along. It's on page 192 in there. If you don't have one, I highly recommend you run out and grab one of those today, but that's what we're going to follow. If you are ever stuck with concepts in molt, I highly, highly, highly recommend you read the introduction in the guide, and then read the section on woodpecker molt. It's very dense, but if you read it more and then look at some woodpeckers and kind of work with things and then read some more, it will become clearer as you go through. So right now, jumping into a downy woodpecker example. So this is a standard setup we use to kind of diagram molt. And this is going to be the downy woodpecker, as I mentioned. And this is a calendar for all intents and purposes. The beginning of the year over here, the end of the calendar year over here, so that we sort of see how things move through the seasons with these birds. So when a downy woodpecker comes out of the nest, it's all in its juvenile plumage. The feathers, as we mentioned before, they're of lesser quality. They don't have very great density of barbs. And this is what your standard juvenile downy woodpecker would look like. Okay, so he's kind of fluffy. He has this red tipping to his feathers on his crown, but it does not extend onto the nape. So in a bird in this downy woodpecker in juvenile plumage, you can tell that it's a male because of this red tipping to the feathers on the crown. And also notice here on this bird how dull the eye is. As the birds age, those also change. The eye gets a much more red tone to going through. Okay, so at this point in time, all of the feathers are uniform. They're not great quality. They're good quality, but they're not great quality at this point in time. Okay, so if we would be following in the molt section in the guide, The preformative molt is going to happen in June to October. Okay, and it's a incomplete molt, which means that all of the body feathers go. Okay, and these lesser coverts here on the top, those are considered body feathers. So the lesser coverts go. Okay, and we have some flight feathers that go as well. Okay, so in this case, the feathers that have completely molted are our primaries. Now, if we think about passerines, the primaries tend not to molt in these preformatives, but in a woodpecker lifestyle, they sit on a tree and they get a lot of solar exposure, and solar is really, really hard on feathers. So it causes them to degrade quite quickly. So these feathers that are very exposed will need to be replaced, unlike passerines would tend to retain their primaries. And unlike passerines, the primary coverts did not molt with their primaries. In a passerine, when you have a primary that molts, generally the primary covert goes with it. There are, of course, exceptions to that. Okay. Also, what happens? We lost one tertial here in this molt. So this will happen. This molt will happen, and it takes quite a while in woodpeckers. They're not in a huge hurry. So in the time from June to October, they will go through the first cycle preformative molt, and these feathers will change. Now, this is just one example. There's going to be variation, of course, as things go through. All right. So this is an example of what a bird in first cycle formative plumage can look like. If you'll notice here, the two outermost greater coverts were retained. They look different than the innermost greater coverts. And all of the primary coverts, they kind of have a dull brown look to them that contrasts with those replaced greater coverts. As you can see the browner color and the darkness here. And all of these primaries have been replaced already. It's hard to see when they're stretched out like that, but they've already all been replaced as well. Okay, so this is a bird in a first cycle formative. And this bird here will retain this plumage, and it has both juvenile and formative feathers in this plumage, and this plumage would be called our formative plumage. And it would go from December 31st, there'd be no change until January 1st. And so if you're looking at the calendar system, it has gone from a hatching year bird to the second year bird just by flipping of the calendar. Biologically, nothing has happened here. So if we wanted to age this bird, we would still call it a first cycle formative because the first cycle isn't over yet, but it is now a second year bird. So in the Humphrey and Parks system, the cycles are started with the pre-basic. So we started with the first cycle in the nest here, in the hatching year, and we're just about to end the first cycle. Okay, so we would go through our second pre-basic molt, and we would have a changeover. So according to the guide, we're just kind of working with the pile guide and learning how to read that. We can read the second pre-basic usually includes all the secondary coverts. So we've got all these secondary coverts in here, all molted, and then the primaries will molt again, and the rectrices, but only 1 to 5 outer primary coverts. Okay, and sometimes 1 to 4 secondaries can be retained in this little block right here. So something that I've kind of gone off the rails on is that I have also had these inner primary coverts molt as well. So this is something that we found out fairly recently, that in the specimens when Peter was doing a lot of this research and other people were doing this research, is that when you're looking at specimens, the wings are closed. And so you can't see those inner primary coverts. Now that we have more and more photos with the wings open, we found out that these feathers, oh, there we go, are also molting. So we can see these inner primary coverts are molting as well as those outer primary coverts. Okay, so right now, we still have a second year bird, but it has changed cycle. So biologically, this bird has changed. It's now changed into its second cycle because it has gone through its second pre-basic molt, and this bird is considered in its second cycle basic. So notice how there are no formative feathers remaining on this bird. Okay, there are just retained juvenile feathers and basic feathers. So we have a special code when we're coding for maps. We have this R code, which is only used in woodpeckers. Well, I guess some other species, not used in passerines is what I should say. We have this retained code saying that we have both juvenile and basic feathers. The secondaries as well would be coded R for that retained feathers. Okay, so we flip the calendar page again between December 31st and January 1st, and now we're calling this bird a third-year bird. So calendar-wise, as we count our calendars, it has changed age, but biologically, it's just another day older. It is still a second cycle basic bird as we move through time. Okay. All right. Life of woodpecker, there's no pre-alternates, but this bird has been definitely old enough to mate and produce young in its second calendar year and again in this third calendar year. Now, by this point in time, these juvenile feathers that are remaining, they're getting pretty worn and are looking a little rough. We'll see some photos later, but these birds, they will definitely be able to see these juvenile feathers compared to the basic feathers at this point in time. All right, we are ready for our next pre-basic molt. Okay, and this is our third pre-basic molt. So in this third pre-basic molt, we can have secondaries retained. And so that's what we've done is we've got some of these secondaries here. These are old basic feathers that are retained, and we still can have some of these older basic feathers that are retained. So you're going to have multiple generations of basic feathers. So when we're coding for maps, we call this an M, seeing multiple generations of basic feathers. Now, in this, you could have some retained juvenile feathers. We're not going to do that in this particular example, but you can. Now, in a lot of the woodpeckers, you get a lot of molting that happens and only a few feathers are retained. The sapsuckers, which we'll talk about in a little bit, they tend to be, I don't want to call it less molty, but that's kind of how my brain thinks about it. They don't replace as many feathers each time, so we'll see how that pattern can look a little different. So in this case, usually for the downies, when the time you get to the to this time of year, so we're in the end of our third calendar year, there's often no juvenile feathers remaining. It doesn't mean there can't be, but there's often no juvenile feathers remaining. But you can have a mix of different generations of basic feathers. Sometimes they're easy to see, sometimes they're not. So don't be afraid to take a good look at your woodpecker wings or take a photo of them, because they can, when you really zoom in, you can start seeing more and more things happening. Okay, at this point in time, these molts are often complete. So you can have a wing that is all one generation as well, and it's all basic. Okay, at this point in time, this bird, we know it's an after second year bird, and it's getting close to its definitive cycle. We don't have any juvenile feathers, so we can't count forward and see how far along we are. We do know that this is definitive cycle though. Okay, and then this cycle can continue. And then it tends to be, as you get older and older, these molts tend to be more and more complete. Okay, so this is just the general outline of how the woodpecker molts work. Here's an example we have of a photo. This one is from northern Alberta. Now this bird is in molt, so it looks a little different. So can you see here we have some actual molting feathers going on here. Okay, and can you see up here, these are really, really nice brown feathers right in here. So these are our juvenile feathers. This outer feather, okay, this is not a juvenile feather. And this has not yet been replaced this year because we're still working down here, and the direction of molt is from these inner primaries outwards. So we know that this feather was replaced at a different time. Okay. I'm going to see if I can get to the next slide. Doesn't want to behave at the moment. Go. There we go. Okay. So what we have in here is a little bit more detail of what is happening on this feather tract. Okay, so we definitely have these juvenile feathers in here. And then we have definitely got a basic feather up here. These feathers here, they're not juvenile with this nice rounded edge, but we're not sure if they're formative or not. So they look a little different, not a ton different, but a little bit different. So we've questionably called them formative because they can be replaced during that first molt, but we're not sure. This feather up here, this is a new basic feather. So it's coming in right now. So if we're looking at this, we would score this retained because it has retained juvenile feathers and basic feathers in here and in that pattern. Okay. And so if we were to score this, we would say this bird is in molt. So it has a P in here. indicating it's during a pre-basic, and that it's going into its third pre-basic molt because it still has these retained juvenile feathers. And so I'm going to go back up. Okay, so just kind of put in your head what this looks like, and I'm going to go backwards to this diagram here, and we have the case here, okay, where it still has some of these retained juvenile feathers. It's in this section here. We don't know if these will be replaced during this molt or not. They have not yet been replaced because we're still back here in the primaries. So we're right in this section here where we still have some juvenile feathers, but they could be replaced as time goes on. All of your molt questions with downy woodpeckers, I am sure, are answered right now. Before I go on, does anyone, I'm going to stop the share for a second. Does anyone have any questions at this point? So I'm going to add a layer of complexity with the sapsuckers. Okay, we have masters.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Lauren.
I was just wondering, during the definitive cycle basic, the retained basic feathers, is the only way to tell that just like where on the feathers?
They just look like, I don't know if I'm understanding your question properly. Like, do you mean like, are they, the where will definitely be different. Oftentimes they still retain their circles. If you know how they have like those white circles on the feathers, they will retain those, whereas the juvenile feathers won't have those. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? I can't see you very well, so if you have anything, speak up, jump in. No? Okay. All right, well then I am going to jump into sapsuckers. You guys are on the cutting edge of this research at the moment because this paper that Peter wanted me to share with you guys is currently reviewed. So it might change a little bit, but I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff with the sapsucker molt. So sapsuckers are, of course, woodpeckers, but they have a slightly different molting strategy. They retain more feathers than a lot of the other woodpeckers do. So, and it has a lot to do with their migration strategies. So these are our different sapsuckers here along the bottom. And so this is the paper. It's coming out. Hopefully will all be shared with everybody soon. And then these are some of the graphs in them. And it just explains how different species can molt more or less depending on their migration strategy. So the yellow-bellied sapsucker keeps its juvenile body feathering the longest, red-naped sapsucker the next longest, and Williams sapsucker the shortest, and that all relates to their migration strategies. So just we'll be looking for this paper, but I'm going to not dwell too much on this because I want to go through how the sapsuckers actually molt compared to the other woodpeckers. So these are some of the figures that are in the paper. And what's really, really cool is that in this molt is that the primary coverts and the secondaries molt convergently in a Staffelmauser-like pattern. So there's your new word of the day, Staffelmauser, and it's a wave of molt. And so I find the first couple times you try and think about it, your brain wants to explode. But what it means is that a feather tract starts molting. It does not finish molting. And then the next time the molt happens, the molt starts at the place it stopped last time. So the tertials are always getting replaced because they're very exposed. The primaries are always getting replaced because they're very exposed to the sun. But these secondaries, this is in sort of a wave-like fashion. So these are our tertials here. We're kind of going to ignore them. In the second cycle basic, so in that second pre-basic, these two feathers and S1 were replaced. In the next cycle, these two feathers were not replaced. Okay, so the tertials here, these are replaced every molt because they're very highly sun exposed. And these here, the primaries, are molted in every pre-basic as well because there's so much sun exposure. And then these secondaries, during the second pre-basic molt, these are molted as well as S1. And then in the Staffelmauser action, these feathers are not molted, S1 and these two inner secondaries are not molted, but then the next set of feathers is. So you're getting different generations of basic feathers and you're still retaining your juvenile feather. into that third cycle basic. And then in your fourth cycle basic, you've lost all the secondaries, but you can retain one more of these juvenile primary coverts, which allows you to count the number of generations. So you can count 1, 2, 3 generations of pre-basic feathers, and that allows you to answer it as its fourth cycle basic. These black feathers, I mentioned earlier on in the talk that when you're looking at specimens, the wings are often just closed. So what's happening inside of those feathers is not known. That's why they're black. We just don't know what's happening, but it's expected that they're molting from both sides. So we're going to go on to some color photos where we're going to take things one step at a time, and then hopefully things will be a little clearer. Okay, so we started just like we did with the downy woodpecker. We have a wing that's all juvenile. It's not very good quality. And in the woodpeckers, just like the sapsuckers, this P10 can be quite long. After it's not a juvenile feather, this P10 is significantly shorter. So I've been caught where I'm trying to age a bird third year or fourth year and seeing if the things are uniform or not. Then I remember to look at P10 and see if it's long. It's a great hint to reset you and think, oh, long P10 juvenile woodpecker. I have fallen into the trap many, many times. So that's your trick for the night. Look for P10 to see if it's long or short to determine whether or not it's a juvenile or whether it's an adult and you need to go further. Okay, so we've got our first cycle juvenile feather wing here. Okay, and then we're going to go into our first cycle of formative plumage. And as I've mentioned before, all of the primaries molt in sapsuckers because of the exposure and in woodpeckers in general. This is a little bit different because in a lot of woodpeckers, all of these lesser coverts often molt, but in the sapsuckers, they're not as molty. They often don't molt all of their lesser coverts. They molt just a few of the inner medians and some of the lessers, and not all the way out to the wing. So most of this wing in a first cycle formative bird remains juvenile, which is different from what we saw on the downy woodpecker when a lot of these feathers were replaced. Okay, so we're first cycle formative. Okay, this is happening, and then we're going to molt. We're going to start our second pre-basic molt. So this is happening when the bird is about a year old. Okay, this is going to be a second year bird that's doing this, and things have started to molt. So in this case, they have, most sapsuckers have 10 secondaries, which is different than the passerines, which have 9. These are still our tertials here, but instead of being 7, 8, 9 as they are in the passerines, they're 8, 9, and 10 in the sapsuckers. Okay, so what happens in here is that the S9 is the first feather that molts. So this isn't exactly in the greatest of orders, but it kind of gives you an idea of what is happening in the secondaries. So in this case, all of the lessers and medians and graders molt, the alula molts, all the primaries and molt, okay? And then we're going to have some of our primary coverts. So our P primary covert 10 molted, our S1 molted, and our S9 molted. From there, okay, it's going to go bilaterally. So we tend to think of molt going in straight lines, but it's pretty cool that in the tertials, it starts in the center and then goes bilaterally out to get those other feathers happening. And S1, I left S1 in just so you have a reference point, and that P10. So this is all, okay, and then from there, in that second pre-basic, we can have a couple more feathers molt inward. So they're molting not necessarily in the direction that we think. We always think that things are molting in the secondaries, in the passerines, from S1 approximately or closer to the body. But in the woodpeckers, we have this interesting thing where these two feathers here are molting from the body towards the end of the wing, so distally, which is pretty cool. And so then this is what you will get as your final wing for a second cycle bird. This bird has still got some of its juvenile feathers, actually has quite a few juvenile feathers remaining, which is pretty cool, so that we can count how many generations it's had. So it doesn't have any formative feathers left, but we do know that it has gone through a second cycle basic feather to get to where it's going. Okay, so now we're going to start the following year. Okay, so we're going to start our third pre-basic molt. Okay, the first one was in the nest. The second one was the bird was about a year old as a second year bird. Then bird is about 2 years old, and it's going into its third cycle. Okay, once again, we have this S9 molting, okay, because the tertials are going to continually be replaced because they get a lot of sun exposure. We have all the bodies and the greater coverts molted, and then we have all of these primaries molting because they are so sun exposed. Okay, so our P10, our primary covert out here, it molted last time. This time it will not molt. It will remain retained, but this time we'll get P9 molting. So it's coming inwards. We think of the primaries going outwards, but these primary coverts are going the opposite direction of what we would think that would happen to passerine. So it's pretty cool. So this is where we get our Staffelmauser. The things that were replaced last molt are not being replaced this molt. Okay, and as we continue, the tertials will all get replaced because of the sun exposure, and then we might get another primary covert, so P8 molting as well. So this time we had 2 primary coverts molt, and then continuing on, we do not replace these secondaries, S1 or 7 and 6 are not replaced, but we get these other feathers molted inwards as well. So all that we're left with is 1 retained juvenile feather, and this is what a third cycle basic sapsucker would look like. So it's got a really cool pattern where it has, we don't know what's happening under these feathers because they're hidden underneath. More than likely they're molting inwards as well, but we don't know for sure. We have some retained juvenile feathers. We have some brand new basic feathers, and then we have this older basic feather sitting there. And then the same thing are happening in the secondaries where we have that cool mix. All right. Now, what's cool about sapsuckers is because it has retained this juvenile feathers for so long, as it goes into its 4th pre-basic, we can see yet another cool pattern imagining. It's like this rainbow bird at this point in time, but all in black and white when you actually look at the birds. Okay, so once again, S9 is going to go. We're going to get all those tertials replaced, all of the coverts replaced, all of the primaries replaced. Okay, and then we're going to continue in the directions that we had going from S1 and from the proximal side of the wing. So that final juvenile feather on the secondaries is replaced, but we still can have one of the juvenile primary coverts remaining even at this point in time. So because we can count these numbers of generations, and we have 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations, we know that this bird's in its 4th cycle of molt. And so then we have this bird that's a 4th cycle basic feather bird. Once we lose, I don't think I went that far. Once we lose these juvenile feathers and we can't count the number of generations, we have to call it a definitive cycle bird. But if it has 1 generation, 1 juvenile feather remaining, and we can count the number of generations, we can age these sapsuckers to the 4th cycle, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so let me look at my time here. Okay, so these are some photos from that will be associated with that paper. So if you want to dig deeply when that paper comes out, you can look at some of these photos as well. So this is our 2nd cycle bird, and you can see here that we have all of these juvenile primary coverts remaining. And then in the secondaries, you can see we still have some juvenile secondaries. We have a basic S1, and then we have basic tertials. And then going from there, we still retain these juvenile feathers here, but we're getting replacement from the other outsides of these primary coverts. So they're coming inwards, just like we saw in those other diagrams. And same thing in the secondaries. These ones are our juveniles in orange. We get our 2nd generations of basic here. So this yellow matches this yellow, and we still have this blue basic from before. And then we have these brand new basic feathers here. And then we're getting into our 4th cycle where we can count the juvenile 1, 2, 3, and 4 generations there. And then finally, when we don't have any juvenile feathers left, that's when we need to call these birds definitive cycle. There's lots of different generations, but no super worn juvenile feathers left. You can see these juvenile feathers back here in the 4th cycle. They're looking pretty rough. But even though we have different ages of definitive cycle basics, they're not as worn as those juveniles were. Shirley, I see you unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to go back to the photos of the sapsuckers,
Okay.
and go through it again a little bit slower.
Okay. I don't know. I don't know who's out there and who's still on board. This is good. This is good where I'm going. Okay. So this is the picture you wanted to see, right?
Got to share your screen again, Danny.
Oh, I can see it just fine. I don't know why you can't see it.
We're pretty good at reading your mind.
Okay, that's good. How about this picture? Is this the picture you're looking for?
Awesome.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I don't think I can zoom. You know what? I'm gonna get out. Actually, I'm gonna stop sharing and then I'm gonna reshare. I'm gonna see if I can do this twice in a row. And I'm just gonna go to here and I'm going to, then we can zoom in on individuals, I think. Oops, or not, because I have to have skills.
Oh, there we go.
There you
Yeah,
go.
let me see if I can. Which one did you want to see? Oh, now I've done it.
Oops.
You want to start with this one?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Just,
Yep, I can do it if I try. Oh, there we go. Okay, I have the power now. Okay, so this is our second cycle bird. All right, so we have no replacement of these feathers. Okay, but we have had replacement of other feathers. Okay, so our primaries are all replaced. We've had the tertials replaced because they get so worn, and we've had S1 replaced. See how nice it looks compared to these ratty juvies? Okay, and so if we step back to, there's no formative feathers left on this bird because it did not molt any of the secondaries in the preformative. So any changes that have happened are happening in the second pre-basic.
Danny, did you say that the juvenile feathers will not have the white dots on them?
Okay, so maybe, but I'll clarify because who knows what came out of my mouth a little while ago. So they have, as you can see, their feathers, they all start out looking black like this with the white dots on them. But because the white is not as strong, see how it's been eaten away? Like they're kind of holes now. They started with white dots, but the white dots get eaten away.
Ah, okay. I was confused.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. All right. Should we go to the next one?
Yes.
All right. So we're going to move over here. Now we're looking at this one. All right. So now we're getting the inward, from either end, inward molting of those primary coverts. So we still have the juvenile ones in the middle. I don't know where my cursor has gone. Can't point with anything. Oh, there it is. Nope, don't know where my cursor is. It's gone. So anyways, we have the juvenile central primary coverts. They are still retained and they're starting to look a little tough, rough around the edges. But you can see two feathers on the outside, one on the outside, one on the innermost side, that look much nicer. Those feathers are basic feathers, but they're third cycle basic feathers because nothing got replaced during that second cycle pre-basic.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's pointing inwards. And then in the secondaries, the juvenile feathers, to me, they don't look as brown as I would expect them to be, but there's always variation. But you can see they definitely 100% have no white dots left on them. They're totally eaten out of there.
Right.
So the center ones look brownish. I've seen them look browner. The next one out to the right, it looks a little nicer. And then the outermost one looks kind of in between because it's moving inwards. So the yellow one was that first, not the juvenile, but the second basic it was put in. And then that blue dot was the newest generation because it's the nicest and blackest.
Great.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So then we're going to go back over here and down a level. Okay, so now these cool sapsuckers, they continue to molt inwards. They're not going to touch the stuff they've already molted, but they're going to continue from those spots and move inwards. So if you're looking at the primary coverts, you still have a few juvenile primary coverts left. The blue dots right next to them, they're the nicest feathers because they were just replaced. The ones next to those, outermost from those are looking a little rough, but they're basic feathers. And then even further out, there's another generation of basic feathers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the same sort of thing is happening in the secondaries, but we've already molted out all of the juvenile feathers. Right now, we just have basic feathers that are beginning to look a little rough. You can see that green dotted feather that came in during that second cycle basic, and it's so old, it's lost all of its white dots as well.
Right. Right. Got it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this one, we still have juvenile feathers in the primary coverts, but no juvenile feathers in the secondaries. And then in the last photo, we don't have any juvenile feathers left. There's none of that super brown that we had in the primary coverts, but there are definitely different ages of basic feathers. Now, when I say definitely, when I look at these birds in the field, I'm like, is that or isn't that? Do I catch the light right? Can I really see that? So you might second guess yourself, but they're not the super brown. The super brown you can see, but sometimes these differences in the basics, it gets a little tricky to see them depending on your light and things like that, and how much experience you have with it. So you can have different generations, but no super browns.
Thank you. That was great. And thanks for explaining about the white just wearing away. I forgot about that.
Great. Did anyone else want to go back and look at anything, or did it all make sense? Hey, John. What can I do for you?
Just, what I'm kind of thinking about is, are there situations where you're seeing, several generations of feathers in the sapsucker, and you're having trouble saying, is that a juvenile feather, or is just that a feather that's 3 generations old and it's trying to trick me into a juvenile feather? And do you have any tips for avoiding that pitfall?
The juvenile ones, so I find that the basic ones are black. They're just not as black. The juvenile ones turn brown. And so it's definitely a subtlety between brown and black, but it's kind of like when you look at this Zoom screen, like everybody has a black square with their name in it, but it's not the same black as the outside square. I don't know how you're looking at this, but that's how it looks on my screen. Whereas the juvenile ones would be brown. So there's just a difference in whether it's a faded black or whether it actually has a brown color. Does that help?
Yeah, that does. Thanks.
And then never be afraid to say, I don't know. Take a picture, say, I don't know.